This is the second segment of our interview with Mark Krawczynski. We're talking about sustainable architecture, and we are create to sustain. Mark, we were talking about the inherent difficulties of changing the mindset from a centralized model to a decentralized model, which is one of the crucial aspects of why the projects that we'll be talking about now are so important. If you would tell us perhaps a little more about the buildings that you've been designing.
Well, now after 6 years of research with many experts from all over the world, it all seems fairly obvious. If the power is there in nature and it's free, and if the costs of converting that power to electricity has gone down by 90%, why aren't we doing it? Because as human beings, we are basically defensive in our thinking. It's working now, why change it? We'll just do more of it, and faster and better. We'll build bigger nuclear power plants. We'll build bigger coal mines. Well, I'm sorry, but those two things are rather destructive to our health, to our environment. They're a risk.
And they're expensive.
And they're expensive. And we forget about that. And they are normally a long way away from where people live, and so you have to have all this enormous cost of transmission lines all over the country. Well, but people make a living out of building the transmission lines. Sure, they make a living out of selling drugs too, but does that mean that we're going to promote selling drugs? These are not necessary elements of our technology, the way that our society should develop. I really feel that because the technology already exists at a low cost, and if you include it, the key challenge is that if you build buildings, you should build them from the start with the intention of them being energy producers, without noise, without pollution, without anything. It's not that hard. But you can't build another standard building 1,000 times to build another city, and then add on a few tricks of technology afterwards.
That's when it gets expensive.
That's when it gets expensive, and it's not efficient. It has to be done right at the beginning of the planning process.
Buildings of the, if you like, the building stock out there in our cities is getting replaced at somewhere around, what, 2% per annum, more or less, right?
Yes, more or less. Yeah.
It's going to take us an awful long time to re-engineer those buildings 2% at a time. And it's going to be an expensive process, and it's not going to actually happen fast enough. So
Well,
the idea of creating buildings that are actually energy producers appears logical, but naysayers will say this is just too expensive and too complicated.
Well, the truth of the matter is that it's cheaper than what they're doing now if you allow for the cost of thousands of kilometers of transmission lines and very expensive, let's say, a nuclear power plant 200 kilometers from Warsaw. Incredibly expensive.
So again, we're talking about the, if you will, the full cost of ownership and use, as opposed to simply creating the thing that you move into, and then you start to calculate the other costs.
Exactly. And if you build your building, if you plan it from the beginning in a position where it can catch wind and sun and water from every direction, you have a building which is not any more expensive. It's just that it's absorbing the forces of nature, and these forces are enormous. I remember in Sydney as a young student, I was walking on Circular Quay, and they just put up the first 3 high-rise office buildings of about 25 to 35 stories. There was a day where I actually did a drawing of people being blown off their feet because the wind was so strong coming between the buildings that they couldn't walk through because their umbrellas were dragging them off and throwing them into the traffic. I thought, gee, that's incredible force. I wonder if one day we'll get to use it. Well, now is the time when we have the technology to do this. Do you know that if you actually put, and this is giving the game away, of course, but everybody should be aware of this, how simple it is. If you don't put buildings in rows, but you put them nose to nose, they will catch the wind from every direction of the compass. They will compress that wind, because if you take wind from a distance of 80 meters and you compress it to 8 meters, you have a much more dynamic wind force in the middle of those three buildings. And in fact, when we started this wonderful journey of exploration of what can be done to make cities more livable and more environmentally aware, we were working with Butch Dalrymple Smith, who was a British sail designer,
a naval architect.
A naval architect, and he was living in France, and he inspired me to go ahead with this because he built some amazing sailing boats which were just using wind and sun to sail around the world without any other power source. I thought, well, if he can do this on the sea, why can't we do it in cities? And that's where it all started. And since that time, we found that you can actually do all this with current technology at very low cost, because the buildings are still going to be built the normal way, but you just orientate them in such a way that you can collect the wind. You can put in vertical turbines between those buildings, which are, you can't even hear them when they're operating.
Let's have a look at a picture.
Yeah, this is.
Why don't we?
Yeah, this is a large fantasy which we started off with, because we thought, well, we can build this as large as we like. Buildings like this already exist in Dubai and in many other cities in the world, in China, but they don't collect the wind. If you actually make the buildings converge in the middle, and you put wind turbines in the center, you can make 10 megawatts of power from these turbines in the center.
Let's just put it in perspective. What is 10 megawatts of power?
It's enough to run a, well, I put it in this because I've actually got the figures in front of me, because I have so many figures in my head of what each energy can produce. Here we have a smaller version, which is more acceptable to most city situations, European cities especially, because it's only 18 stories high. And this situation even works with a building which is 6 or 7 stories high. Now in this case, we can produce, I'll read this because I get lost otherwise. We can produce 8.5 megawatts of power from this building because of the turbines in the middle, because of the solar panels on the roof, and the solar panels on all the walls. The beautiful thing is that solar panels are so sensitive, so effective now, that they will work even when the building is in shade, as long as there is daylight. Of course, they'll produce a bit less power, but all the walls can be producers of energy. If you use all those elements without any other fancy tricks, just those vertical turbines and solar panels on the roof and all the walls, you can make 8.5 megawatts of power, which is about 30% more than what this building of 25 square meters needs to work all the time. Air conditioning, lighting, lifts, heating, all those things will need about 5.5 megawatts of power to satisfy all the building's owners, all the building's users, not just owners. So we have the solutions, and the cost is about 18% more, 1/8, so it's less than 1/5 of the cost of a normal building for the extra technology. But then you've got free power for 30 years.
So you have a power station built into the building at 18% more cost.
Basically, the building
seems
is
to
a
me
power
a
station.
fairly decent deal. I don't know. These buildings that we're looking at, they're very much city buildings.
Yes.
They're mixed use, hotel, commercial, office, what have you, retail. And rightly so, because our cities are getting bigger. As our cities are getting bigger, our built environment gets more dense. And we know that the built environment is the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So our cities get bigger because more people move to cities. More people will continue to move to cities and will do so at an even increased pace as climate change causes the seas to rise and large swathes of land become uninhabitable. So our cities, our built environment will get larger and larger, creating more and more greenhouse gases, something of a vicious cycle, don't you think?
Well, with this, you get a zero carbon footprint. You generate no pollution whatsoever. And as you said, cities are getting more dense. I like the idea that cities are getting more diversified, so you're getting mixed use very often in buildings now. The American dream of having a house in the outer suburbs and traveling every day.
And then driving an hour and a half there and back.
And back. And then living and then working in an office building which had no other facilities except offices and maybe a McDonald's down the bottom. Nothing wrong with McDonald's, but you know, it's not the culture of a whole society. But you lived in one place, you worked in another, and you commuted hundreds of kilometers every week. Even in Sydney, I had friends who actually spent more time in the car than in the office, because the guy had to drive 2.5 hours in the morning and 2.5 hours in the evening.
These are large cities we're talking about.
These are large cities.
But even Australian cities, 4 or 5 million people, they're not that large by world standards. So these kinds of localized, decentralized power stations, if you will, are a likely solution. But you're still talking about concrete and steel, and concrete and steel do have a very substantial carbon footprint.
Well, it doesn't have to be concrete and steel. It can be just solar panels as walls.
Okay. I like this. Solar panels as walls. Tell us about this.
Well, you have solar panels now that you can see through and still absorb the power of the sun. But they can actually be, well, they're quite waterproof for a start. You can actually make a solar panel be your spandrel panel, the wall below the window. Instead of making a concrete wall or a concrete spandrel, you actually make that a solar panel.
And these are structurally robust enough?
Well, you can make your frame in steel or in concrete. The walls, I mean, the spandrel panels below the windows don't have any structural significance at all. They're just a weight. So if you make them out of solar panels instead of concrete panels, they're lighter and the building becomes less expensive to build. So these changes are not difficult to implement, but it means thinking in a new way. And one of the reasons why the change hasn't happened is because if something is working, and you know, once again, it's a stratification of responsibilities. You got the guys on the tools who know how to build concrete, and you got the guys who supply the concrete, they know how to drive trucks. You got the guys in the office who are number crunching and working out how they can save 5% of concrete to make the walls a bit thinner. And you've got the economists who are working out how they can get a better finance. And you've got the guy on top who says, well, gee, we only made $1 billion this year. Let's make it 1.2 billion next year in profit. Oh, good idea. All right, well, we'll make more buildings. Sure. But nobody actually thinks about changing the system. So it's easy to reproduce and reproduce faster and better and make more money. But where is this going to end up? We'll end up having very inefficient buildings. We'll end up having incredible waste of energy.
And we're going to have to rebuild them anyway.
Exactly. And you say 2% of buildings get replaced every year. Well, goodness, if I was a realist, I would say if we replace every building in the world in the next 50 years and make it a clean building and we have zero pollution, we'll save the planet. Now, I know that's too simplistic. There'll be many other pressures. There'll be many other challenges on the way. But you could replace all cities in 50 years. Now, I don't think that'll be too late, because at 25 years we'll be halfway there. We'll probably stop the increasing pollution and the climate change will slow down.
And we were worried about the Kauai 2 bug not that long ago. It's only been 20 years if you think about it. So 20 years is not a long time. I think this is possibly the right moment to take another breather.
Sure.
You are with Create to Sustain, and we'll be back with Mark Krawczynski in our third and final segment of this interview. Thank you.
Thank you.